Today we will be looking at the recent horrifying Laos caving tragedy that happened on May 20th, 2026, where a group of local men entered a remote cave in central Laos, searching for gold. But while they were underground, heavy rain began flooding the cave behind them. One man managed to escape and raise the alarm. 7 others were still trapped inside. What followed was a desperate rescue through mud, darkness, rising water, and narrow flooded passages. Some men would make it out alive. Others would remain missing deeper inside the mountain. And then, rescuers heard something from the cave. A knocking sound. The story is still developing. As always, viewer discretion is advised. In the 3rd week of May 2026, a group of local Lao men entered a remote cave in Saisomboon province, about 120 kilometers north of Vientiane. They were not tourists. They were not part of a formal cave expedition. They were not entering a famous show cave with lights, railings, signs, or a marked route back to safety. They were local villagers moving into a raw mountain cave for something practical and dangerous. They were searching for gold and valuable minerals. Only 5 first names from the trapped group have been publicly reported: Kamla, Mued, Ing, and Layan. The names of the 2 other trapped men have not been reliably released, and the man who managed to reach the outside and raise the alarm has also not been publicly identified. So this story keeps those men unnamed. The cave they entered was not one continuous tunnel. It consisted of 5 known chamber zones, with a possible 6th chamber or deeper continuation beyond the final confirmed chamber. That structure is the key to understanding the disaster, because the men were not moving through one open passage. They were moving through a segmented cave, where every chamber was connected by crawls, drops, muddy restrictions, and water-prone sections. Once flooding entered the system, those connections became the real danger. From the entrance, the route moved into the 1st chamber zone, the outer section of the cave. This was the transition from daylight into the underground system, but it was already not an easy walking route. The passage quickly tightened into low crawls, and in some places the gap was only around 60 centimeters wide. That meant the men had to crawl, squeeze, and pull themselves through mud and rock. Even before the cave became deep, it was already forcing them into positions where turning around would be slow. Around the 150-meter mark, the route entered the 2nd chamber zone. By this point, daylight was gone. The entrance was no longer a visible opening behind them. The men were now far enough inside that if water rose behind them, their retreat could be cut off before they even understood how bad the flood had become. Past the 2nd chamber zone, the cave continued toward the 3rd chamber zone, where the passage bent deeper into the mountain. This was the transition before the main descent. The cave was no longer just moving horizontally through rock. It was preparing to drop, and that changed the risk completely. In a cave, a downward route is always more serious, because every meter down has to be climbed back up later. Often when the body is tired, the light is weaker, and the air feels heavier. Around the 250-meter mark, the cave reached the 4th chamber and descent zone. Here, the passage angled sharply downward at around 45 degrees, dropping roughly 50 meters into the mountain. In dry conditions, this would already be exhausting. In muddy conditions, it became a chute. Beyond that descent was the 5th chamber zone, the deepest confirmed chamber area. This section had a rocky plateau, but it was not flat ground. The floor was broken by sudden drops, including one drop of around 4 to 5 meters, and another of around 2 meters farther in. So even after reaching the 5th chamber, the cave was still difficult to move through. It was not an open room. It was broken underground terrain. From the 5th chamber, the route continued farther toward the 350-meter gold panning zone, where there may have been a deeper continuation or possible 6th chamber beyond the confirmed map. That possible continuation would later become the most important unanswered part of the entire rescue. This was the cave the men entered: 5 known chamber zones, a narrow outer crawl, a 2nd chamber at around 150 meters, a deeper transition zone, a 45-degree descent around the 250-meter mark, a lower 5th chamber with broken drops, and then a possible deeper continuation toward the gold panning area. On a dry day, that route was already demanding. During the rainy season, it was a trap waiting to close. Rain in a mountain cave system does not behave like rain on a road. It does not need to fall directly into the entrance to become dangerous. Water can land higher on the mountain, seep into cracks, gather inside unseen channels, and enter the cave from behind the people underground. A crawl that was open on the way in can fill with muddy water on the way out. A low passage can collect sand and gravel. A slope can turn into a drain. A narrow restriction can become a sealed plug. Around May 20th, while the men were inside, heavy rain began changing the cave. The water did not have to flood the entire system at once. It only had to block the right places. The 60-centimeter crawl sections were vulnerable because they were narrow. The lower passages were vulnerable because they collected water. The steep descent was vulnerable because mud and debris could move downhill. The route between chamber zones was vulnerable because each connection was a choke point. At first, the danger may not have looked final. That is how many cave entrapments begin. A person waits, checks, retreats, hesitates, and then suddenly the cave reaches the point where the decision is no longer theirs. The exit was blocked by floodwater, mud, and debris. The men were now trapped inside the chamber system, but the flood did not catch everyone in the same position. One unnamed party member was still close enough to the outer route to fight his way back toward the entrance. His part of the story is important because it explains why the rescue began at all. He was not simply walking out of a calm tunnel. He was escaping through the early sections of a cave that was already changing behind him. The route was wet, unstable, and closing, but for him, there was still a narrow window where the entrance could be reached. He made it out. Behind him, 7 men were still underground. That single escape turned a hidden disaster into a rescue as he contacted authorities immediately. But even after he raised the alarm, the rescuers did not have a clean picture. They knew men were trapped. They knew the cave had flooded. They knew the route was blocked. They did not know which chamber the men had reached, whether they were together, whether they had air, or whether water had already forced them deeper. The first stage of the rescue was not extraction. It was locating the living inside a cave that was still dangerous. Local rescue teams responded first, and Thai rescue workers soon joined the operation. The entrance area became a technical work site. Pumps had to be brought in to lower the water. Ropes, lights, helmets, diving equipment, oxygen tanks, stretchers, and communication support had to be staged near a cave that did not allow easy movement. Every item of equipment mattered, but none of it changed the basic problem. The rescuers had to pass through the same route that had already trapped the men. The first push inside was slow, because the cave forced it to be slow. In a flooded chamber system, speed is not bravery. Speed is how rescuers become victims. A rescuer who gets disoriented inside a flooded cave cannot simply swim upward, because the ceiling is rock. The only safe way out is back through the same passage they came from. By May 24th, the rescue had expanded into a serious operation. Thai volunteers were now working with Lao teams, trying to reopen the root chamber by chamber. They had to pump water down, clear obstacles, and test the passage ahead. The cave was not giving them a straight route. It was giving them short gains. A crawl cleared, a water level lowered, a blockage opened, a few more meters of passage made possible. By May 26th, the teams had pushed deeper into the system, but the operation was still full of uncertainty. The men had already been underground for days. Their lights could be failing, their food could be gone, their bodies would be weakening from hunger, damp air, cold rock, and stress. If they had found a chamber with air, survival was possible, but survival would depend on staying still, conserving strength, and waiting for rescuers to reach them before the weather changed again. The international cave diving element now became more important. Finnish diver Mikko Pasi and Thai diver Norazed Benz Palazing were among the key rescuers pushing into the cave. This was the kind of environment where cave diving experience mattered immediately. The water was muddy, the passages were narrow, the cave was not only flooded, it was physically restrictive. A diver had to be able to move through bad visibility, manage lines and equipment, and stay calm inside passages where there was no room for panic. Then, on May 27th, the first major breakthrough came. Rescuers reached the 5th chamber zone. They had pushed beyond the outer crawl, beyond the 2nd chamber area, beyond the tighter internal sections, and down toward the lower part of the cave. This was the zone beyond the steep descent and broken chamber floor, the area separated from the entrance by hundreds of meters of difficult passage. Inside that 5th chamber, they found 5 men alive. Kamla, Mued, Yi, Ing, and Layan had survived. They were not standing near an exit. They were deep inside the system, sitting on a rocky ledge in the lower chamber zone, pale, weak, and covered by the gray dampness of the cave. Footage from the discovery showed the men huddled on the ledge as rescuers reached them. They were exhausted, hungry, and trapped, but they were alive. That moment changed the rescue, but it did not end it. Finding men alive in a cave is not the same as bringing them out. Between the fifth chamber and the entrance were the same hazards that had slowed the rescue for days. Narrow crawls, muddy water, steep passage, uneven drops, poor visibility, and the constant risk that rain would return and refill the route. The men were also physically weakened. They had survived the wait, but survival had cost them energy. Moving them through the cave would be far more difficult than reaching them. Rescuers gave them supplies and checked their condition. Water, soft food, and foil blankets became as important as ropes and diving gear. The men needed strength, warmth, and enough stability to handle the extraction plan. The rescue team now had to decide how to remove them from the fifth chamber, guide them through flooded sections with divers, or keep pumping water until enough of the route opened for them to crawl and walk out. Both options were dangerous. Guiding an exhausted miner through a flooded cave is not like helping someone swim across a pool. The survivor may not be a trained diver. The water can be opaque. The passage can be too tight to turn around. If panic takes over, the rescuer has to control the survivor while protecting his own equipment and finding the way out. But waiting for water to drop also carries risk, because the same rainy season that caused the disaster can destroy the rescue window. At the same time, the operation was still incomplete. 2 men remained missing. The fifth chamber now became both a survival site and a question mark. 5 men were alive there, but the cave continued beyond it toward the 350-meter gold panning zone. If the 2 missing men had moved farther inside before the flood sealed the route, they could be beyond the fifth chamber, separated by a narrow, muddy continuation. On May 28th, the extraction problem became more technical. The team needed enough breathing support and staged equipment to move people safely through the route. Oxygen tanks and refilling capability mattered, because each entry into the cave consumed time and margin. Rescuers had to go in, check the men, prepare them, support the route, and still have enough reserve to get back out. By May 29th, the first extraction was ready. One of the 5 men would be brought out first. His identity was not immediately confirmed in all reliable reporting, but the method of his rescue is clear. He had to be guided through a narrow, flooded section by an expert diver. This was the part of the rescue Miko Pazzi later described as a trust me dive. That phrase matters. A trust me dive is not proper training. It is not a controlled lesson. It is what happens when a person who has no real cave diving background must put his life in the hands of the diver beside him. The survivor has to breathe through a regulator, stay calm in muddy water, and allow the rescuers to move him through a flooded restriction, where he cannot simply stand up, surface, or see the exit. The passage was so narrow and difficult that the divers had to control the movement carefully. There was no room for a normal mistake. The survivor had to keep breathing. The rescuers had to keep him positioned. If he panicked, grabbed the wrong thing, pulled at the mask, or fought the equipment, the situation could become fatal for everyone in that restriction. For about 37 minutes, the extraction moved through the cave. In open air, 37 minutes is short. Inside a flooded cave, it is long enough for every weakness in the plan to show. The route that had trapped the men now had to become the route that released one of them. Then the first man reached the entrance. He came out mud-covered, weakened and unsteady, supported by rescuers as he emerged from the cave mouth. He had survived more than a week underground, and then survived the most dangerous part of the extraction. But outside, there was no time to treat the moment as the end. 4 men were still in the fifth chamber. 2 were still missing. The cave had released 1 survivor, but the rescue remained active. The team prepared for more extractions. Then, on May 30th, the cave gave them a narrow opportunity. The water level dropped enough to open part of the route. Pumping and reseeding water created a short window where movement became possible. In cave rescue, a window like that cannot be wasted. If a flooded restriction becomes passable, it may only stay passable for a limited time. One storm can close it again. The 4 remaining men in the 5th chamber saw that chance and took it. Instead of waiting for the divers to repeat the same full extraction process one by one, the men began moving toward the entrance as the water receded. They crawled, climbed, and pushed through the muddy route, with rescuers nearby to help them through the broken chamber floor, the descent zone, the narrow passages, and the water-affected sections leading back toward daylight. This was not a simple walkout. Their bodies were weak from hunger and days underground. The cave was still muddy and unstable. The route still demanded crawling, climbing, and careful movement. But the water had dropped enough to change the situation from impossible to barely possible. One by one, the 4 men emerged. Outside the entrance, the rescue site changed from controlled tension into visible relief. Some of the men collapsed after coming out. Some were wrapped in foil blankets. Oxygen masks were used. Stretchers were ready. Rescuers cried, embraced, and reacted with the kind of emotion that only comes after days of trying not to imagine the worst. By then, 5 men had come back from inside the mountain, but the cave had not given back everyone. 2 men were still missing. At that point, the operation changed shape. The focus moved away from extracting the men found in the 5th chamber, and toward the one part of the cave that still had no answer. The 5th chamber became the reference point for the deeper search, because the cave continued beyond it toward the gold panning zone. The key question was whether the 2 missing men had gone beyond the 5th chamber before the flooding cut the system apart. This is where distance becomes deceptive. On a map, the deeper continuation may not look far, but in a cave, close means nothing if the passage between 2 points is blocked. A person can be only 20 meters beyond a flooded crack and still be unreachable. If the connecting passage is too narrow, muddy, and underwater, that short distance becomes another world. The possible 6th chamber now became the central mystery. The suspected route toward it was not a clean tunnel. It was a narrow crack or restriction beyond the 5th chamber, heavily affected by muddy water. This is one of the worst environments in cave rescue because it removes almost every advantage a rescuer has. Visibility can fall to 0. The diver may have to feel the passage rather than see it. The body may need to twist through rock instead of swimming normally. Equipment can catch. Turning around can become impossible. That meant the missing 2 could be alive in a deeper air pocket, and still nearly impossible to reach. By May 31st, the weather turned against the operation again. Heavy rain refilled sections of the cave, with water rising as far as the 2nd chamber, and blocking divers from entering deeper until pumps could lower the level. A drainage pump also failed, making the situation worse. This is the brutal rhythm of flooded cave rescue. Teams can gain ground for days, and then one storm can take that ground back overnight. The search did not slow because hope was gone. It slowed because the cave became dangerous again, sending divers into a reflooded system with 0 visibility, narrow restrictions, unstable water levels, and a possible body twisting crack could create more victims. Good rescuers know that ignoring the cave only gives it more lives, so the operation expanded above ground. If the main entrance route could not be passed safely, then the mountain itself had to be searched for another way in. Teams began looking for air shafts, chimneys, dry passages, cracks, or vertical openings that might connect to the deeper section. Radar scanners, satellite images, and terrain analysis became part of the rescue because the problem was no longer just inside the cave. The entire mountain had to be treated like a map. If an alternate shaft connected to the right chamber, it could change everything. If it connected to the wrong void, it would waste time. If it was blocked by rockfall, it would be useless. If it was unstable, it could kill rescuers before they ever reached the missing men. But with the main flooded route unreliable, every possible opening mattered. Then came the most unsettling update. On June 1st, rescuers reported hearing knocking sounds from inside the cave system. The sound came after workers knocked and then heard what seemed like a response. In a rescue like this, a sound can redirect an entire operation. It can suggest that someone is still alive beyond the flooded restriction. It can give rescuers a reason to keep searching one specific area. It can give families a reason to keep hoping. But a cave can deceive. Water carries sound. Rock reflects it. Empty chambers distort it. A knock can travel through cracks and return from a place that is not where it seems. So the sound could not be treated as proof. It was only a possible signal, and that made it even more haunting. By then, the two missing men had been underground for nearly 2 weeks. If they were alive, they needed an air pocket, drinkable water, and enough strength to survive hunger, cold, darkness, and the psychological pressure of being beyond the chamber where the others had been found. If the knocking was really them, then they may have been close enough for sound to move through the mountain, but still separated by a passage rescuers could not safely cross. That is the most disturbing part of the Laos cave disaster. The final known timeline is clear. A group entered the cave looking for gold and minerals. Heavy rain and flash flooding blocked the exit. One unnamed villager escaped and raised the alarm. 7 men remained trapped. Rescue teams from Laos and Thailand pushed through the cave, later joined by international specialists. On May 27th, 5 men were found alive in the 5th chamber. On May 29th, 1 man was guided out through a narrow, flooded passage in a difficult extraction. On May 30th, 4 more men came out after the water level dropped. Then the operation shifted toward the 2 missing men, the possible 6th chamber, the search for alternate shafts, and the unexplained knocking sounds from inside the mountain. For the families, that is the hardest kind of ending, because it is not really an ending at all. A confirmed rescue brings relief. A confirmed death brings grief. But uncertainty traps everyone in between. Every hour the cave remains blocked deepens the question no one outside can answer. 5 men came out alive. 2 remained inside the unanswered part of the cave. And as rescuers searched the mountain, pumped water from the passages, studied the chamber system, and listened for sounds behind the rock, the entire story narrowed down to one question. Was the knocking truly coming from the missing men? Or was the cave only giving back an echo? The story is still developing.